Hello, I am the AI voice of Gwyneth Paltrow. Mark Casper has asked me to read the presentation he has prepared for you today. I should start with a bit of a confession. The reason I am speaking to you right now is that when Mark gives this presentation live, it usually takes over 2.5 hours. He gets sidetracked with stories, he wanders off on tangents about microwave disputes, and he generally rambles. He has brought me in as a matter of professional brevity. My job is to keep us on track so that we can cover this entire 13-page contract in exactly 1 hour, leaving 5 minutes at the end for your questions. Before we look at page 1 of the February 2026 revision of the Florida Realtors and Florida Bar as its residential contract, we must establish the foundational rules for contract writing at Berkshire Hathaway Home Services Florida Showcase properties. In the world of residential real estate, there are 3 major contracts: the listing agreement, the buyer brokerage agreement, and the contract for sale and purchase. Understand the difference. The listing agreement and the buyer brokerage agreement simply get you the job. They establish the relationship and the expectations, but they do not pay you. The only document that actually results in a commission check hitting your desk is the contract for sale and purchase. This is the product. If you are going to call yourself a professional, you cannot be a tour guide who just shows houses. You must be a technical expert on this contract. Your clients expect you to know every word they are signing. They expect you to protect them from every potential disaster that could cost them their deposit or their home. If you don't know this contract backwards and forwards, you aren't an advisor. You're just an expensive passenger. They are paying you for your expertise in navigating the things that can get them into trouble. If you look at the left-hand side of your document, you will see that every single line of this contract is assigned a number. Throughout those 13 pages, you will see an asterisk next to specific line numbers. This asterisk is your most important guide. It indicates a blank that requires your attention. To ensure this contract is completed properly, you must follow the rule of the asterisk. At a minimum, every line with an asterisk must have an entry. If the answer to a question is nothing, you write the word nothing. If a section does not apply to your specific transaction, you write N/A for not applicable. Never ever leave a line on the contract blank. Furthermore, throughout this contract, you will see various deadlines that have pre-printed defaults, such as the 15-day inspection period or the 30-day loan approval window. Even if you want to use that default number, you must write that number into the blank. Leaving a blank suggests you didn't see it or didn't discuss it with your client. Writing 15 on that line proves you are awake, professional, and paying attention to the details. Now, let us begin with the parties on page 1. The top of page 1 is not a numbered section, but it is the most critical part of the entire document. This is where we define who is actually making the deal. Lines 1 and 2 require the full legal names of the seller and the buyer. Do not ever use a nickname, and do not pull the seller's name from the MLS. The MLS is a marketing tool, not a legal record. You must verify the seller's name through the property appraiser or a public deed. If the home is in a trust or owned by multiple siblings, every single legal owner must be listed here. If you are missing a signature because you didn't identify a legal owner, you do not have a contract. You have a potential disaster. Section 1 covers the property description. The importance of this section cannot be overstated because you are defining exactly what is being sold. You have to first define what it is you're selling. Obviously, you're selling the land and the improvements, which is handled by the legal description on line 9. But paragraph 1D handles the personal property. Your goal in this section is to thoroughly define exactly what your buyer will find when the seller moves out and your buyer opens the door to their new home for the first time. There should be no surprises. The only way there can be surprises is if you don't pay attention to this section. Most permanently installed fixtures are already handled by the beginning of the personal property section when it lists out ceiling fans, draperies, and other items. However, notice what is not on that list. Microwaves, washers, and dryers are not auto-included. If those items are in the house and your buyer expects them, you must write them in on line 21. If you don't, the seller can legally take them. I once saw a deal nearly fall apart over a robotic pool cleaner. The agent thought it was pool equipment. The seller thought it was a vacuum. The seller took the $800 robot. The buyer was furious, and the agent ended up buying a new one out of their commission. If your buyer wants the microwave, the washer, the dryer, or the pool robot, write it in on line 21. If you don't define it, you are leaving it to chance. If you need a more exhaustive list of what constitutes a fixture versus personal property, refer to your Florida Showcase properties as is contract playbook. Section 2 is the purchase price and escrow. This is the math of the deal. Paragraph 2A is the initial deposit. If you leave line 30 blank, the law defaults to 3 days for the buyer to get that money to the escrow agent. Now, listen closely to our office policy regarding that deposit because this part is vital. We have a zero tolerance rule for transmitting wiring instructions. We once had a situation where an agent forwarded an email from a title company to a buyer. That email had been intercepted and hacked by an Eastern European syndicate. The buyer followed the instructions in that email and wired her entire life savings to criminals rather than the title company. To protect your license and your client's money, you are never to email, text, or forward wiring instructions. Instead, your job is to provide the buyer with the verified phone number of the title company or attorney. You tell the buyer to call that number directly and speak to the closing agent to receive instructions. We stay out of the middle of the money transfer entirely. No exceptions. Section 3 is the time for acceptance and the effective date. This is the heartbeat of your file. The effective date is not necessarily the day the buyer signs the offer. It is the date when the last party signs and delivers the final initialed copy to the other side. Every other deadline in this contract, your inspections, your title search, and your financing, is a countdown that starts from this date. If you don't know your effective date, you don't know your deadlines. Section 4 handles the closing date. Let's talk about line 54. In some circles, you will hear people use the phrase on or before a certain date. In this office, we do not do that. On or before has no legal weight and only serves to create confusion. If you write on or before March 1st, the seller might think they are closing early, even though the buyer is under no obligation to close until the 1st. Conversely, the buyer might think they can force a closing on February 22nd if their loan is ready. They can't. A contract must be certain. Choose a firm, specific date. The only way to change a closing date is for both parties to agree to that change in writing. If you are presented a contract with the words on or before while representing the seller, you must tell them, the closing date is March 1st. The buyer is trying to communicate they might be ready earlier, but you are under absolutely no obligation to change your timeline. Once we sign, it will be entirely your choice. Section 5 is the extension of closing date. This section discusses extensions for specific scenarios like force majeure and TRID. These are narrow, legally defined exceptions that allow for a delay in closing due to events beyond a party's control, like a hurricane, or due to federal lending disclosure requirements. We will cover the mechanics of these terms in later sections where they are spelled out in more detail. For now, understand that Section 5 is not a buffer for laziness, it is a legal safety valve. Section 6 covers occupancy and possession. This is about defining when the buyer actually gets the keys. Line 65 has 2 checkboxes. Unless there is a very specific broker-approved reason, you should always check at time of closing. We avoid pre-occupancy and post-occupancy agreements like the plague. The moment a buyer moves in before closing or a seller stays after closing, your real estate contract has effectively become a lease. You are now dealing with residential tenancy laws and massive insurance liability. If the water heater bursts while the buyer is in pre-occupancy, who pays for it? Stay away from these arrangements unless you have specific broker approval. Section 7 is assignability. There are 3 choices here on lines 84 through 86. My advice for our standard residential transactions is to select may assign but not be released from liability. Why? Because it gives your buyer flexibility. If John and Mary Smith decide mid-transaction that they want to close in the name of the Smith Family Trust, dated November 4th, 2012, this selection allows them to do that without needing a formal addendum signed by a potentially grumpy seller. It also helps if a lender suddenly requires one spouse to be removed from the deed for financing reasons. Now, if the seller's agent pushes back on this, don't waste time trying to educate them on what I'm educating you on. Just change it to may not assign. The only real effect is whether you will need a signed addendum later to make a minor change in the buyer's name. Section 8 is the financing section. This is a massive section with high liability. First, understand the distinction. The contract asks if this is a cash deal in paragraph 8A or a financing deal in paragraph 8B. A cash deal on line 88 does not necessarily mean the buyer isn't getting a loan. It just means the contract has no financing contingency. The buyer is telling the seller, I am buying this house, and if my bank says no, I am still coming to the table with a check or I'm losing my deposit. This is an incredibly strong way to write an offer if the buyer has the funds. However, if they need the contingency, we use paragraph 8B. You will notice an asterisk on line 91 for the loan approval period. The default is 30 days. But listen to our specific strategy here. We want to protect that financing contingency at all costs. To do that, we match the number of days for the loan approval period to the number of days between the effective date and the closing date. If you are closing in 45 days, set your loan approval for 45 days. If we ever extend the closing date, we always extend the loan approval date simultaneously. This keeps the contingency alive until the very end, protecting your buyer's money even if the bank's underwriting department has a meltdown 24 hours before closing. If you let that loan approval date pass, the contract automatically converts to a cash deal, and your buyer's deposit is now sitting in a bullseye. Section 9 covers closing costs, fees, and title insurance. This section is a list of who pays for what. Paragraph 9A lists the seller's costs, including the deed stamps and the owner's title policy if you check the right box. Paragraph 9B lists the buyer's costs, like the mortgage stamps and recording fees. In Citrus County, our local custom is reflected in paragraph 9C1. Usually, the seller designates the closing agent and pays for the owner's title insurance policy. This is common in our market, but it is not a law. In many other counties, the buyer pays. Always double-check your checkboxes on lines 158 through 162 to ensure you aren't accidentally committing your client to a $3,000 expense they didn't expect.
All right. You can cut it here.
Part 2, the disclosures, the standards, and the finish line. Section 10, disclosures. Moving into Section 10. We often refer to this as the boilerplate section, but for a professional, there is no such thing as boilerplate. Every line here is a potential shield for you and a potential trap for your client. The importance of Section 10 is education and liability shifting. By including these disclosures, the state is ensuring the buyer cannot later claim they were unaware of certain environmental or legal realities. Paragraph 10A is radon gas. This is a naturally occurring radioactive gas that, when accumulated in a building in sufficient quantities, may present health risks. The law doesn't require the seller to test for it or fix it. It simply requires that the buyer be notified of its existence. My advice: if a buyer is concerned, they should test for it during the inspection period. Do not try to be a scientist. Point to the contract and say, "The state requires me to tell you this exists. If you want a test, we can schedule one." Paragraph 10B covers mold. Like radon, this is an educational disclosure. In Florida's humidity, mold is a reality. This clause tells the buyer that if they are concerned about toxic mold, they must perform their own due diligence. Paragraph 10C is the flood zone disclosure. This is where your expertise in Citrus County really shines. You must tell your buyer that if the property is in a special flood hazard area, their lender will require flood insurance. Here is your Monday morning rule. Always ask the seller for an elevation certificate early. If the seller doesn't have one, the buyer may have to pay $400 to get one just to find out if the insurance is affordable. This disclosure protects you from a buyer who closes on a house and then realizes their flood insurance premium is $5,000 a year because they didn't check the zone. Paragraph 10E is the lead-based paint disclosure. If the property was built before 1978, you must check the box in Section 19 and provide the required lead-based paint pamphlet and rider. This is federal law. Failure to do this doesn't just mess up your deal, it can result in massive fines from the EPA. Section 11, property maintenance. This is one of the most misunderstood sections of the as-is contract. Agents often think as-is means the seller can just walk away and let the house fall apart. That is absolutely false. Section 11 creates a maintenance requirement. It states that the seller shall maintain the property, including the yard and pool, in the condition existing as of the effective date, ordinary wear and tear excepted. If the air conditioner worked on the day the buyer signed the offer, it must work on the day of closing. If a tree falls on the garage 3 days before closing, the seller has to fix it. If the seller stops paying the pool guy and the water turns into a swamp, the seller is in breach of Section 11. Your job as a professional is to ensure the house the buyer is walking into is the exact same house they fell in love with a month ago. No surprises. Section 12, property inspection and right to cancel. We are now at the heart of the as-is contract. This is the section that gives the buyer their right to cancel. The importance of this section is to allow for total due diligence. Notice line 279. This is where you write in the number of days for the inspection period. As I mentioned earlier, the default is 15 days, but you must write 15 in that blank. During these 15 days, the buyer has the absolute right to cancel the contract for any reason, or no reason at all, and receive a full refund of their deposit. They don't have to prove the roof is leaking. They can simply decide they don't like the neighbors and walk away. However, look at line 307, broom clean condition. This is the number one cause of closing day friction. Sellers often think broom clean means I took most of my stuff. Buyers think it means the house is sparkling. In our office, we educate our sellers that broom clean means All trash removed, all old tires in the garage gone, all half-empty paint cans in the shed disposed of. If you are representing the buyer, you tell them, the seller is required to leave it broom clean, which means no debris. They are not required to professionally steam clean the carpets. Setting these expectations on day one prevents a 3-hour argument at the final walkthrough. Section 13 through 17, the legal mechanics. These sections are the rules for when things go wrong. Section 13 handles escrow. It explains that the escrow agent is not a party to the contract. If there is a dispute over the deposit, the agent cannot just pick a winner. They must hold the money until both parties sign a release or a court tells them what to do. Section 14 is your shield. It is titled Professional Advice. It explicitly states that we, as real estate agents, are not experts in law, tax, environmental matters, or home construction. When a buyer asks you, is this electric panel safe? You point them to Section 14 and say, the contract we both signed advises you to seek the opinion of a licensed professional. Let's call an electrician. Do not ever take on the liability of an expert you are not. Section 15 covers default. If the buyer fails to perform, the seller's sole remedy is generally to keep the deposit as liquidated damages. This is why we fight so hard to protect that deposit. If the seller fails to perform, the buyer can sue for specific performance, which is a legal way of forcing the seller to actually sell the house. Section 17 is the prevailing party clause. This is vital. It says that in any litigation, the losing party pays the winning party's attorney's fees. This is the only thing that keeps people honest. It makes a buyer think twice before filing a frivolous lawsuit, knowing they might have to pay your lawyer $25,000 if they lose. Section 18, the standards. Now we are going deep. Most agents never read the standards labeled a through 10th. That is a mistake. These are the technical rules of the road. We won't cover all 24, but we will cover the ones that will save your career. Standard A covers title evidence. It defines exactly what constitutes marketable title. It tells the seller they have to provide a title insurance commitment within a certain time frame. Standard F is about closing funds. This ties back to our wiring fraud talk. It explains that all funds must be cleared before the seller has to hand over the keys. This is why we tell buyers to wire money early. If the bank's wire is late and the money isn't cleared, the seller can legally refuse to close that day. Standard G is the hurricane clause, technically known as force majeure. In Florida, you must know this. If a named storm is approaching and the local government offices close or the title companies lose power, all deadlines in the contract are automatically extended. You do not need an addendum for this. It is built into the contract. Standard L handles notices. This is critical. It defines what delivery means. If you email a notice to an agent at 11:59 p.m. on the last day of the inspection period, is it valid? Standard L says yes. It also says that notice to the agent is notice to the party. If the other agent sends you a cancellation and you don't check your email for 3 days, your client is still officially canceled. You must be on your email constantly during deadline days. Standard O covers liens. This protects the buyer from the seller's
I'm going to interrupt this meeting for just a second to say that obviously the AI misidentified some lines and sections. That's why we have the contract here as well. The other thing it doesn't cover in this is what they call the FinCEN, the financial something or other. Basically, we're going to go over that in great detail in the next meeting.
unpaid bills. If the seller had a new roof put on but didn't pay the contractor, that contractor can file a mechanic's lien. Standard O requires the seller to provide an affidavit at closing stating that all work done on the property has been paid for. Section 19, Addenda and Riders. We are at the finish line. This is the checklist of extra parts. If you check a box here, you must attach that document to the contract. If you check Homeowners Association but don't attach the HOA disclosure, the buyer has a statutory right to cancel the contract at any time before closing. I have seen buyers use a missing HOA disclosure to back out of a deal 3 days before closing because they simply got cold feet. Don't give them that weapon. If there is a specific term you need to add that isn't covered by a standard rider, you write it in Section 20, Additional Terms. But be careful. Never write your own legal language if a standard rider exists. Use the pre-printed forms whenever possible. Closing
And come to your broker if they're not. If you run it by me, I take on the legal risk for your language, and you can't get fined for acting as an attorney.
dot. We have covered all 13 pages. You now have the full picture. You know why the effective date is the heartbeat, why on or before is a nightmare, and why matching your financing dates is the only way to truly protect your buyer's money. Being a professional means you aren't guessing. It means when your client looks at a blank with an asterisk, you can explain exactly why that number matters to their future. Use your Florida Showcase Properties as is contract playbook to study the fine print we discussed in the standards. Knowledge is your only real product. Master this contract, and you will master this business. I will now turn it back to Mark for your questions. Thank you for your time.
Okay, just as a little wrap up to this, so that we can keep this in the video and then we'll open it up to general questions. I'll just edit that part out because everybody has different questions. This is about a 40-minute take on the contract. As I've said, I've done this in as many as 3 hours over 3 training sessions. I think that there's so much involved in this contract and so many things that can and do go wrong that people who've been, as long in the tooth as I am have seen almost all of these things happen. So I'm going to give you all the tips and tricks. I'm putting everything I know into that playbook. I'm about 80% done with it. I'll give you a link to it and you'll be able to see it as it updates. But basically, I'm taking 6 years worth of training on these contracts in video forms and written forms, and I'm trying to condense them into something that a new agent can watch at the very beginning and at least have a sense of what they're dealing with. So that concludes our basic training for the as-is residential contract for sales and purchase. And the reason I'm giving you that here with your orientation is this is the only way we make money, folks. If we can't fill this thing out and get these things successfully to close, then it's all academic, meaning you don't get paid. No offense. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for your time.